Right, good evening and welcome to MedChi. I hope you've all signed into the register as usual, but if you haven't, can you do so at the end with your email address so that we can contact you? We've got apologies this evening from Don Rose, Mike Elliott and Suresh Patel. It's with great sadness I really want just to make an announcement this evening that some of you may know that Tom Venables died last Saturday. As you know, Tom was president of this society between 1996 and 1997, and he was a member of this society for over 40 years. His funeral is going to be held at St Wilfrid's Church in Calverton on Wednesday, the 6th of February at 2 o'clock for anyone that would like to attend. And we can send you the details if you'd like to contact Anne. She will let you know any more details. Tom, as many of you know, was a GP in Calverton. He joined the Calverton practice in 1970 and stayed there until he retired. In 1972, he became one of the first GP lecturers in the Department of General Practice and taught medical students for over 25 years. And he also was a trainer, an examiner for the MRC GP, and he was a good friend and colleague. So could I just ask you to stand for a moment to remember Tom and reflect? Thank you very much. Now, our last meeting was on the 10th of January. The minutes of that meeting are available in printed form in the desk at the front. And if you remember, that was Neil Dixon talking about the history of the GMC and the introduction of revalidation. Tonight's a very special little date in the MedChi calendar. As you know, my nominated charity this year is the Carers Trust. And before I introduce this evening's speaker, I'm also very pleased to introduce Maura Fraser, who is Director of Policy at the Carers Trust, who's travelled up from London today to be with us. And I'm just really pleased she could come up this evening. I'd just like, if you could invite Maura just to come to this up here now, just to say something about the Carers Trust.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much, Nigel, for inviting me to be here, and thank you so much for the honour of being your the charity that you've nominated. There are so many that you could have chosen that I'm really delighted that you've chosen us. Carers Trust is the largest national organisation dedicating to supporting carers. So, and by carers we mean friends and family members who are unpaid and who support someone who is disabled, someone with a long-term condition, someone who is older and frail, or someone with mental health problems or drug or alcohol use problems. And I think I'm probably talking to the converted, because you probably know that 10% of the population of this country are carers, as borne out by the most recent census results. 1 in 10 of the population and 1 in 10 of you are carers. And we also know that the majority of care in this country, much as we love the NHS, is not provided by the NHS and its workforce, and it's not provided by local authorities and their workforce. It's provided by friends and family who sometimes give up their own aspirations in life and their own health, their own jobs, their own financial security to care for someone in their family or a friend. Now, carers are from all backgrounds and all ages. The youngest person that we support in our network, we believe, is 4 years old. We don't know how old the oldest person is, but we certainly have people in their 90s, well into their 90s, who are full-time carers. And the spectrum of that is just almost mind-boggling. But what we know all those carers have in common is that they have a right to a life of their own. They have a right to achieve their own aspirations in life. They have a right to a break. And they have a right to have their own health and well-being properly looked after. And so that's why we're here. We're here to make sure that carers' issues are respected in government and by decision makers, in the media, so that people understand about caring and what being a carer means. And also so that hopefully people understand that they might be a carer, because it's a term that often people are not very sure about. They don't know if they're one or not, or they might not want to say that they are. So we need to make sure that people are aware of what being a carer is, and that that's something to be respected and valued, but also that you have choices if you're a carer. You should only have to do what you're happy with doing, and there should be choices that you can make in life too. Carers Trusts supports around 200 local carers organisations across the UK, supporting in turn, who directly in turn support about 450,000 carers. Whilst that's a vast number of people, it's only a fraction of the number of carers that there actually are. So there's still a massive job to be done. And now we've worked extensively with Nigel and his colleagues at the Royal College of GPs, trying to get to those carers that we don't know are out there yet and we haven't got support to yet. So doing things like making sure that GPs understand the importance of identifying a carer and making sure they're referred to support to their local carers organisation, because that can make the world of a difference. The difference it makes is having to stop because you can't cope and being able to carry on and do the other things that you want to do in life too. And that's not just a human issue, it's also an issue about resources. If we support carers for longer, they can go on caring. And we all know that the implication that has for the taxpayer and for the cost of residential care. So I just want to say thank you so much to you for your support, but also so much thanks to Nigel for his support, not just in terms of what he's done this year with you, his colleagues here, but also what he's done to support us and to support carers over many years, because he's really, made the issue one which general practitioners are aware of and doctors more widely are aware of, and also has become an issue on a national scale. And it's about time it's an issue on a national scale. So we can't do this without cash, clearly. So whilst the publicity is important and whilst the media awareness is important, whilst government is important, also it's important that we have the funds to do this, because without the funds, I wouldn't have a job, my colleagues wouldn't have a job, and we wouldn't be able to get the message out there and get the support out there to carers who need it. So thank you so much to everybody here. Thank you so much, Nigel, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much, Maura. That's really kind of you. And there is a donation pot outside, so if you would like to fill it, it would be absolutely great this evening on your way out. And just with great pleasure now, I'd like to introduce Dame Philippa Russell as our speaker this evening. Now, Philippa chairs the Standing Commission on Carers, and I've been a member of the Standing Commission since it started in 2007, so I've been able to witness Philippa's enormous power and influence is at the highest level of government, which is extraordinarily impressive. Now, Dame Philippa was awarded an OBE in 1999, a CBE in 2002, and a DBE in 2009. I just heard some news on the way up today about council tax, and I just think you might be given a bill for a second home at Buckingham Palace. But anyway, well, Philippa was formerly a disability policy advisor to the National Children's Bureau, a commissioner with the Disability Rights Commission, Director of Council for Disabled Children. She's an honorary Fellow of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. In 1990, she was awarded the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Centenary International Award for women who have contributed to the field of learning disability. In 2005, she was awarded the Royal Association of Disability and Rehabilitation Lifetime Achievement Award for the furtherance of human and civil rights of disabled people and their carers. She's got honorary degrees from numerous universities, and Philippa is also a parent of an adult son with a learning disability and was a carer for her mother who had dementia. I'm absolutely delighted and privileged to ask Philippa to talk to us this evening.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Nigel, thank you very much for that warm introduction, which made me feel really embarrassed. The privilege is entirely on my part to actually be invited to speak to you. And I welcomed Moira's introduction because caring and carers have to be part of all our business. When my son was diagnosed, Simon is now 39. He had brain damage when he was born. He has hydrocephalus, which is well managed by a shunt. He was one of the first lucky recipients of a shunt that didn't go wrong, as it happened, down at the Westminster Children's Hospital. We were in a Foreign Office posting in Central Africa, and we'd hoped Simon would be an ordinary little boy. But it was obvious that things were wrong, and we brought him back to Guy's Hospital, to the Newcomen Centre, where Ronnie McKeith was one of the great pioneering paediatricians. And I remember getting the diagnosis that Simon had severe learning disabilities, that he would always have difficulties, and saying immediately, we'll have to give up everything, we'll come back, we'll make Simon our life. And Ronnie McKeith took me aside and he said, everything you give up for yourself because you think it's morally right, you give up for your son. If you want your son to have an ordinary life, he said, you've got to be a positive carer, and if you don't like the way services are, it's your role to be a partner in changing them. But he emphasised the partnership. And my father was a consultant, obstetrics totally different to Simon's, neurological and other problems. But he took the same view. He said there has to be a partnership between health, social care, education, very much in its early days when Simon was born. But we have to recognise that carers are going to be absolutely crucial to the well-being of the people they support. Exactly as Moira said, nobody really expects to be a carer, and I think most people don't like the title. If anybody asked me, are you a carer, I suppose my instinct would be to say no, though I know that I am. If my husband, who had a serious head injury after an accident, then had a stroke, and now has a variety of serious sort of cardiac problems, if anybody said to him, as his GP did the other day, well, your wife's your carer, is she okay about this, about something? My husband turned around in horror and said, she's not my carer. I mean, the assumption that you have a carer can be quite scary, and I think this is part of our challenge, to get the balance between the person needing care and support and the family member that's trying to offer that support. So, thinking about caring, we are living in the 21st century in a very different universe, aren't we? Somebody asked me earlier this afternoon, and I've been asked many times in the past, you've been a carer for a long time, over 3 decades, your mother had dementia as well, have things got better? I think the answer is that the quality of provision has got better. I think our understanding of carers and the role of families has got better. Treatment has got better. People are living for longer. But of course, they're often living with significant problems. And carers themselves age. And I'm struck by the number of elderly carers that I now meet. And I'm struck also by the number of mutual carers where people, younger adults with learning or other disabilities, have actually become the carers in the family. And as the King's Fund said at an event last week, whether we like it or not, we have to rethink what 21st century health and social care looks like, because there are going to be huge demands on resources. We will have to co-produce much more than we've done in the past, but this also means changing our attitudes towards families if they are to be partners in care. And as this family carer said at the conference last year, caring is not a career choice. We're here because we care, but it's hard sometimes. Remember, there's usually a family behind the patient. Use us, respect us, or lose us. And as Moira said, carers are really our greatest resource if we use them well. And I've not met anybody who didn't want to care, but I've met plenty of carers who wanted a proportionate amount of care. And I remember Baroness Jane Campbell, who has muscular spinal atrophy, was a very active member of the House of Lords, saying, I need care and support, but I also want a relationship with my husband. I don't want him to become a drudge to my disability. I want him to be able to support me, which of course he will, but I also need the care and support that will enable us to have a normal adult life, and that, I think, is the balance. So 21st century carers and a changing agenda for the NHS and social care. We know from the last census there are over 6.4 million carers, and I think this is a great underestimate, because I think, as we've said earlier, a lot of people don't acknowledge the challenge. At least 500,000 dementia carers. And people can live with dementia for a very long time now, as my mother did. So we are actually looking at some very different trajectories of care. A couple of psychologists whom I'd worked with, one of our Foreign Office postings in Central Africa, met up with me the other week. And they had been very contemptuous when they'd visited me a few years ago about what they saw as the British lack of care for their families, lack of respect, lack of responsibility. They are now taking a very different view because healthcare in Kenya particularly is improving. People are now presenting with dementia. They are living longer. And the families that thought it was all a sort of lack of European attention to families are now having to face our problems too. What is the balance of family responsibility when family members need to work? How do you reconcile different issues in the family? Not easy. Secondly, we know that about 54% of carers give up work to care. Now, sometimes that's absolutely appropriate. They want to work. But with growing numbers of carers of working age, it does matter that the care and support that we offer them enables them to work if they need to. We all know the recent discussions widely spread on the media about the cost of being out of work, about the cost of supporting a family, about the limitations that are now being placed on benefits. And thinking of council tax, my disabled son, who we've done everything we can to help be as independent as possible, we'll certainly now be paying his council tax on his behalf. Okay, we can do it, but a lot of families actually can't. So there's a challenge there. Then we've got the changing patterns of care. We've got more intergenerational care. We've got grandparents who are caring for children, trying to balance childcare, and we know that's very important because of the cost of childcare, with maybe one or two other older members of the family also needing care. Increasingly, it's distance care. My mother spent the first 3 years of her dementia insisting on remaining up in Cumbria. I was in London. It wasn't a compatible journey in terms of informal support. We're also seeing much more complex care being carried out at home. Many families now are performing tasks which would normally, in the normal course of events, be seen as the responsibility of a trained health professional. And that can make any sort of family sharing of family responsibilities very difficult. And then what about health problems of carers? And we've touched on that already, and I know that you are about to have a big new initiative in Nottingham about really improving health checks for carers, and I'll say more about health checks later. All the general range of surveys suggest that 66% of carers report health problems related to caring. 40% of carers have significant depression levels, and it's very, very easy to get depressed when you cannot sort of think of a short or long-term solution for your relative. Older carers have a 63% greater risk of dying in a 4 years period than non-carers if they report strain. And intensive care over 50 hours a week is linked with a 23% higher risk of stroke. In the census, when the interviewer came round to our particular block of flats in London, and we were asked about the number of hours that you were caring, when I totted them up, I realised I was caring for 50 hours a week. And I looked at the 23% higher risk of stroke and thought I'd better be careful. Actually, I feel extraordinarily fit. But the point is that there can be a burden and an impact of care. Carers don't like to talk about burden, but there is an impact of care, and we have to pay attention in terms of if you like, of the economic functioning of the NHS, if not of the human rights of the person who is caring. So changing expectations of users and carers, and I think they have to be seen together. There's a parity of esteem issue. One of the key objectives in the NHS mandate is to improve NHS support for carers through working collaboratively with local authorities and carers organisations to enable the provision of a wider range of support, including respite care. And there's no doubt that carers do need a break. It may not be a long break, it may only be 2 hours a week, but I met a group of carers in West Sussex on Tuesday. I facilitated a workshop for the CCGs along the south coast about what the families needed when their children or their young adults were receiving NHS continuing health care. And the one thing they all categorically said was that they wanted short breaks, and that a couple of hours was not enough when you were doing heavy lifting, carrying and health care at home. And they saw their GPs or their consultants as their advocates with the local authority and others in actually getting it. So there's a health advocacy issue here. And I think we are seeing the rise of the expert patient and carer, or at least a recognition of the reciprocal expertise of carers. Carers don't know it all, but actually they've got an awful lot to share with health and other professionals if we let them. And then we have the new agenda of personalisation and self-directed care and support. And David Nicholson, at a meeting I was at the Department of Health a few weeks ago, talked enthusiastically about the tsunami of change. We're going to move acute care out of hospitals into the community and the family. And one carer piped up in the audience, I hope somebody's going to support me if my home's going to become a hospital. And of course it's right that people should be supported in their own home. But there is an issue here about that tsunami of change and the fact that we are seeing the earlier discharge of patients with often quite complex needs and carers who simply don't know what to do. And having experienced one of those awful 5 p.m. on a Friday discharges with the discharge notes lost and the reablement plan goodness knows where, and my husband coming home and lasting 24 hours before our dearly beloved paramedics came to the rescue, I know it can go wrong, but I also know that was going very wrong for my husband's consultant, who never intended it to happen. It was wrong for the MRI scanning unit, who didn't get my husband in on the Monday morning to scan him. It was wrong for the physio and the OTs that were going to do the assessment that would lead to his discharge. So actually there is a collaborative working together issue here. And so I see families and carers as strategic partners. They're both service users and they're providers. And with personalisation, they're micro-commissioners. We have a personal budget for my son, and it works well. I've chosen to have a managed personal budget, and he has very good support. But I'm struck by the number of angry parents that I've met on some recent fact-finding visits that we were asked to do for the Minister, who said, we're being asked to do more for less. We don't understand direct payments and personal budgets, and a huge anxiety about losing traditional services. It doesn't have to be like that. But that's where all of you, I think, have an important input in ensuring that the future shape of services is understood by everybody and it reflects partnership. So, taking the carers agenda forward, we have a national carer strategy, 2008 with the last government. It was refreshed, that seems to be the coalition government's word, in 2010, and the action plan is about to be refreshed again for 2013. But the key messages in that strategy, and I think they apply to the NHS and social care, were early identification and support, enabling those with caring responsibilities to fulfil their own educational employment potential, personalised support for carers and those they support, enabling them to have a family and community life, supporting carers to remain physically and mentally well, and ensuring that young carers don't carry out inappropriate levels of care and can achieve an education and employment. And as Moira said, there are some very young carers around indeed, and it doesn't mean that they don't want to care, but it is very easy, particularly with a young carer who may fear the advent of social services and being removed from the family perhaps, not to admit that they have a caring role or not to say that it's too much. Now, changing communities and ageing population, we have to get smarter at understanding the hidden lives of carers. And Desmond and Sally, the couple in this picture, are known to me, and they're quite happy to be photographed, by the way, and they know I'm going to talk about them. And I've asked several organised conferences I've talked to what they actually thought, what they thought this picture said in terms of being carers, Desmond and Sally. Various suggestions have been made. Sally's got dementia and Desmond's sort of guiding her along the path. Desmond's had a bad diagnosis and they're holding hands because something's going to change. The reality of Desmond and Sally's life is that actually both do have a long-term health condition. Desmond has COPD, it's quite well managed. Sally has really quite bad osteoarthritis, but again, that's managed quite well. But the reason for them actually looking depressed from the back, as they would if you saw their faces, is that their oldest son has paranoid schizophrenia. When he's well, he's very well. He's a charming young man. I know him. But when he stops taking his medication, he's not. And they feel that although their mutual caring in terms of their long-term condition is respected, when it comes to their son with schizophrenia, that they are not properly informed. When their son is very very sort of paranoid. He doesn't want anything to do with the family. He'll turn up and break the windows of the house, but he won't actually cooperate. And they feel that there is a big issue about carers of people with a mental health condition in finding ways of facilitating a partnership relationship which doesn't damage the integrity of the patient, but does recognise that they have a very challenging role. And their big fear is not their own conditions, which are going to get worse. It's actually what on earth will happen when we're not around to pick up the pieces. So what do carers want? When we were refreshing the carers strategy in Since, there were some sort of key messages. First of all, the time out sometimes. If we get breaks, we're better carers. And carers do say that there are times when they're so tired and upset, they just feel they could walk away. And one carer said, if we carers are part of the workforce, shouldn't we treat them well? Now, somebody once said to me, have you ever felt that you could walk away? And they obviously expected me to say, no, never, I've got it all sorted. And I said, there have been occasions when going up and down to Sussex for my autistic grandson or my husband or my son, gone back to Gatwick Airport, and I've looked at Gatwick Airport and I thought, I've got my debit card, I could get off and fly home to New Zealand. And I don't mean that I'd go forever, but you have this sort of feeling that you just, for a moment or two, you don't think you're coping very well. And I think we have to help carers recognise, A, that it's perfectly legitimate to sometimes feel you can't cope, but B, we want to be sure that people don't get off at Gatwick and fly back to New Zealand, because there are times when you feel you could walk away. And that's when you don't feel an equal partner. It's not the task, it's the exclusion. Secondly, it leads into being listened to and respected. And I so well remember the carer on one of our fact-finding visits who said, I do everything to care for my husband at home after the stroke, but when he's in hospital, I'm just treated as his wife and nothing else. No information. I'm not, but I'm the expert on his care. Thirdly, faster and less bureaucratic assessments and real care pathways. And we have an assessment industry in England. We really do. I've collected assessments. I look round the study at home. They start with the grey filing boxes. They always were grey in the past, sort of grey dappled sort of paper. Now we've gone to red, yellow, orange, or brightly flowered or something from Paper Chase. But I calculated we have literally now got 52 boxes of paper of assessments and reports on Simon. And I'm not sure how useful most of those assessments were. They were repeated in many cases. The useful assessments were ones which were shared with an action summary at the end of it. And in that context, too, we have to be better supported to look after our own health. I remember being absolutely astonished when my GP turned to me. We had yet another visit with Simon, and he said, "What about you?" And I was so astonished, somebody to ask, what about me? I couldn't think of anything to say. But now I'm actually a member of the Practice Reference Group. We're getting a network of reference groups of users and carers in our part of North Camden. And I think I've got I and one or two others have managed to sort of push the message that we've got to be part of the solution. If we don't feel that our views are properly respected, are we presenting them in a way which GPs, which consultants, practice nurses, social workers can respond to? There's a big agenda for all of us. Now, one of the big sort of opportunities but challenges for carers is, of course, the whole reablement and recovery issue. And are carers partners or problems? Reablement is much loved by the government. It's a term which is used in the Care and Support Bill about the future of social care, as well as in the NHS. But some quite interesting mixed evidence about carers' perceptions of the service. Social Policy Research Unit did a review of reablement and looked at carers' responses and reactions in a number of international studies. And there's no doubt that some carers felt much more confident in their caring role. Their husband or their wife left hospital with a care package which set some outcomes, would leave somewhere. Some carers were learning new skills and approaches to support their own family. They felt part of the team, though they wished reablement went on for more than 6 weeks. Not a very long period. But some carers reported continuing often onerous responsibilities which didn't diminish during the reablement period. One carer asked, "What can I not do? I'm so tired." And I think that's an interesting issue too. How can you share the care so that you don't feel too tired? And so just a sort of illustration of the carers' challenge and reablement in the National Stroke Strategy and the consultation within that with carers. The ambition was reablement. The ambition was that carers were part of a multifaceted stroke specialist rehabilitation programme. But carers told us, and I facilitated some consultation events, communication, we want to be part of the recovery team, but not just a piece of equipment like a stair lift, which is how one carer saw herself. Another carer said, and I think this is an interesting dimension of caring, it applies to mental health and dementia too, he, my husband, has become a different person. Sometimes becoming a carer is associated with a life-changing event in the person you care for, and they may be a different person. Their behaviour, their attitudes, etc. may change. It doesn't mean the core isn't there, but it can be very frightening. And then the feeling, of course, not being respected and involved, and the need for emotional support, which is where the carer who felt her husband was a different person really needed that support. There is a lot of emotion about needing care for the first time, and many people needing care will refuse it the first time. I won't have somebody in the house. Saying earlier over a glass of wine that when my husband first accepted or realised that he had significant problems after his accident and his stroke, and we were able to get good carers in. But my husband didn't like the idea of needing care and support. It wasn't part of his image of himself. So the minute I went off to work or my daughter went off to work, he'd send the carers home. So no sooner than I were on the train than I'd get a phone call to say, what should we do? Your husband sent us away. And by then I'd be going through Gatwick probably, so there wasn't much I could do. But I realised then that he also needed a lot of emotional support. We were lucky with our GP, who helped him come to terms with the complexity of his feelings. And we had some wonderful paramedics. I have to say I have learnt to love the paramedics in the last couple of years. I was told by one of them that they are the one part of the NHS where they don't have to account for the amount of time they spend with the patient if that patient then doesn't go to hospital. That's probably not what their commissioners think they're doing. But it was quite an interesting perception, because in a way the paramedics don't have any power over what happens to you. They're almost like people who come into the house, but you feel they're expert. And I did feel that they were very helpful to my husband in coming to terms with a different way of life and accepting that having care didn't mean support, didn't mean you were a failure. And that actually made it easier for me. So carers are like cars. They need regular maintenance to prevent breakdown, a quote from a carer. There is strong evidence that supporting carers does enable earlier discharge from hospital, reduces the risk of readmission. Big ambition for government, keeping people out of hospital. And I'm quoting the Carers Trust here, because the Carers Trust, I think, has really probably the best body of evidence about what does work, what you can really say to hard-pressed commissioners is worth investing in, that actually you can have a strong preventive strategy that helps. And the key factors in carers' breakdowns and readmissions and in admissions to care homes, which can be very expensive, were relationships, not feeling part of the team, and relationships do matter, poor health, tiredness and interrupted sleep. I'm interested back doing some work with the Sussex work with families with disabled children as well as adults, that sleep, interrupted sleep, is one of the commonest reasons for wanting overnight respite care or break. I don't think any of us function well without sleep. We could do with some more sleep services. There are some around, but there are not nearly enough. Then high levels of intimate personal care. There are limits to the levels of intimate personal care that carers often feel they can provide. There's an interesting question here about whether we can actually support carers if they really feel there are certain things they can't or don't want to do. Met a carer the other day about my Sussex consultation who is providing a very high level of support for her husband who has sadly motor neurone disease. They're a devoted couple, but the one thing neither of them want her to do is to manage his indwelling catheter. They have decided that this is the thing that for them spoils the relationship if they have to do it. And the nursing team that's supporting them finds this very difficult to understand. Well, if she can do X, Y and Z, why can't she manage the catheter? But the family feel this is just the thing that they don't want to do. And there will be other situations. Maybe they can be talked around to doing it, but it's not what they want. And of course then the frustration, lack of understanding, treatment or support. But I think we can create and support expert carers. An interesting Australian study, it's described in one of the Sky reviews on reablement. It was a random controlled trial, and they found that 3 to 5 sessions of personal care training to carers, each lasting no more than 30-45 minutes, actually made a great difference and helped the carers to be more confident and encouraged independence at an earlier stage. Now, you might say reablement would provide that, but a lot of carers say they're not actually trained. They're not actually given the practical help that they actually need. And the carers in the Australian study reported improved quality of life because they felt confident, valued, and they understood the short, medium and long-term outcomes for the reablement programme. There's not enough training for carers at the moment. They're just expected to get on with it. And I was shocked that I was allowed to take my husband home as he was, with nobody showing me how to lift somebody or move somebody safely. He's 6'3" and he's big. As it happened, having been a Disability Rights Commissioner, etc., I knew how to lift and move people. But somebody else, it could have been an absolute disaster, and for him as well as for us. So health checks I've already mentioned health checks, and I think there are some real opportunities here and some good messages from the National Carers Strategy demonstrator sites. My London Borough was actually one of the sites, and I know a number of the carers who actually had the health checks, and I know they made a difference. And there are very strong messages from the evaluation by the University of Leeds that looking after carers' own health should be a new priority for an effective NHS. And a lot of us who are carers are not good at looking after our own health. I tell the story against myself that in my GP practice, we do have health checks for carers. The GP practices continue to do them, and they're regularly offered. And in one of our focus groups that we had for local carers recently, we were talking about this, but my GP commented to me afterwards. He said, you're a great advocate for health checks, and I admire it, but how about coming in for your own? And my immediate response, which was, I'm much too busy. I think we actually have to, I was a very bad advocate, wasn't I? And luckily none of the carers there realised. But I think there is an issue here about encouraging carers to have health checks, because 95% of the carers receiving health checks in the National Carer Strategy demonstrator sites felt the service was a good way to support them. They felt listened to, they felt respected. And it doesn't have to be the GP necessarily. It can be a practice nurse, a healthcare assistant, or others. And the improvements reported included the way I look after my own health now. It was so good to talk to the doctor about me for a change. Another carer. My diet, it was dreadful really. I'd stopped caring for myself. This carer felt she'd lost respect for herself and she got it back. My ability to cope with caring, I now feel the professionals are my partners, not my enemies. I feel safer looking after my husband. Another carer, I'm now taking regular exercise and feeling fitter. She'd accepted a direct payment for somebody to actually be with her husband for a couple of hours, to go out with him. Actually, it was a man who went to the pub with her husband, which was, you know, from his point of view, was a good break. And she'd taken up running again, and she felt so much better. And the way I deal with stress, I feel more confident, no more black holes when I can't go on. So health checks really do work, and we need to develop them. And now, just moving on quickly, managing complexity in the carer as a navigator, because I think in many cases with complex conditions, and most disabilities or long-term conditions are complex, there are comorbidities, other issues, they become navigators. And this is courtesy of Barbara Poynton, who is an ambassador for the Alzheimer's Society and a member of my commission. And she said, carers know better than anyone about managing complexity in the web of care that's needed for someone, in her case, with end-stage dementia, COPD, or any of those long conditions which we now live with rather than conveniently die from. If we communicate well with carers, she said, then we have model project managers. We are the experts in care if you let us. We're very cost-effective as well. And here's her web of care. This covers the last 7 years of Malcolm's life. Barbara was determined that Malcolm should stay at home. and she achieved it at quite considerable cost. Not all these people were involved all the time. Of course they weren't, but they interrelated. And Barbara's point is that we are increasingly looking at these webs of care, and really it can only be the carer. She described herself as the spider in the middle, which is not perhaps the most friendly sort of description, but I know what she means. And I think this is a reminder of what happens when people live at home for a good many years with a long-term condition. And it's right and proper, but it does mean that we have to rely on the carer to make sense of that jigsaw. So then there's the issue of parity of esteem between the carer and patient experience, and both are going to be key to better outcomes in a world-class NHS. Now, there's been a lot of discussion with the NHS Constitution and others about whether carers actually do get that parity of esteem with the person who needs services. The Care and Support Bill on social care does recognise parity of esteem. It means that the carer and the user have their own reciprocal but distinct rights. And the NICE quality standards for patient experience in adult NHS services, there are 12 statements about what constitutes quality service. Quite interesting, because they go into detail about what a good experience for a patient would be, but there's a challenge because in only one of those 12 statements do they mention the carer. And they say patients are asked if they want their partner, family members, carers to be given information about their care, and their preferences are respected and reviewed throughout their care. But remember Sally and Desmond, nobody had actually nobody had really considered what the implications were for their son of flatly saying, don't want anything to do with my parents. We actually do need to manage the challenge of confidentiality, the need to know. You don't have to reveal everything. And recognise if we want carers as expert and informed partners, then we have to give them that parity of esteem. And I think that's part of the challenge in measuring the individual care experience, because NHS Constitution again, it must reflect the needs and preferences of patients and their families and their carers. But how do we actually measure that particular care experience? The NHS Outcomes Framework does include carer-specific improvement measure. But as the King's Fund said at a conference last year, we still need good qualitative measures for capturing the experience of individual carers, as well as users of services, to inform service development. And recording patient or care experience is obviously tricky because there are emotions and other things involved. But I think that it is often the NHS that has the best chance of doing it because of that long-term relationship. And of course, general practice is the one service which looks after the whole family, whether they're well, whether they've got special needs, across the life course. So they have to be seen as critical in taking that forward. So how can we achieve that meaningful engagement? David Cameron is passionate about the family and friends test. How can we actually find out what patients think about their experience in hospital? Unfortunately, the test only applies to hospital. But I thought when I first heard of the family and friends test, this was asking the family as well as the patient what they thought, but it's not. It's whether the patient would recommend that hospital service to their family and friends. Quite a few of us in the consultation on the Constitution have said that it may be the carer who's got the best picture of that patient's journey. Was the experience good, bad or indifferent? How was the discharge handled? Actually, both matter. And I think we have an opportunity with the new architecture of the NHS, the JSNA Health and Wellbeing Board's Health Watch, to use creatively. But there's so much turbulence in the system, we've got to be vigilant. And then QOF. We were talking to Nigel earlier, I don't think QOF is the be-all and end-all of guaranteeing good quality support for carers. But Indicator 9, identification of carers in the practice register, which Nigel and the Royal College have fought so hard for, has made a difference. But one of the things that really interested me was that the National Carers Strategy and the Draft Care and Support Bill and the NHS prioritise early identification as a means of prevention. We know that 98% of practices in England and Wales, probably it's up by now, Nigel, receive the 3 QOF points for identification of carers. And and hopefully a register. But I found it interesting in your last report that fewer than 1% of patients on practice lists are currently identified as carers, compared to approximately the 10% of the population likely to be carers. So there's a mismatch between the good intention and the identification. And I think probably the carers groups and organisations and people like myself need to be more proactive in our reference groups about thinking what will encourage carers to self-identify. My practice does encourage carers. There's lots of good information. But it was interesting, we changed our publicity. Instead of saying, are you a carer? And this might interest you, here's a group. We said, do you actually provide care and support to anyone? And we actually doubled our numbers, quite interestingly. And there's something about the word care, and I don't know what we do, but I mean, I won't go into all these sides. So, better together. Somehow we've got to identify, engage, involve patients and carers as strategic partners. But I think we've also got to find better ways of joining up the informal and formal systems. The government talks a lot now about building community capacity, about asset-based approaches to care, which is great if one can actually use neighbours, family, friends, the voluntary sector. But I think we've got to get smarter about finding ways of cutting across to health professionals, to social care and to others. And now sort of coming to an end. I just wanted to give an example of what I think is thinking outside the box. Because if we're going to support carers and improve outcomes for patients, we need to be more creative about how we actually achieve that goal. And the Carers Trust has done a lot of work in this area, I might say. So getting a break. There have been two GP prescription schemes, one in Surrey, one in Cambridgeshire, part funded by the local authority and NHS, which have actually given GPs, and I'll say more about the Surrey scheme in a moment, an opportunity to directly offer a service to a carer that's not a sort of medical procedure. I think we've got to get better at managing hospital discharge, and there are some really interesting projects now with trained carer befrienders from local carers centres on the ward, e.g. Bradford. A carer's lead in every surgery. When we did a fact-finding visit to Dorset, I was really impressed by the carers' leads whom we met and by their enthusiasm for working with local carers. They were a huge support to the GPs, to the practice nurses, some of them were practice nurses, but it was actually recognising that doctors, in quotes, can't do everything, and that we actually need to find a better way of whole practice support for carers. And then we've got the personal budgets. But the Surrey GP short break service, I think it was a particularly good example of a cost-effective partnership between the local authority, primary care and the voluntary sector in improving outcomes for carers. It was joint commissioned, NHS Surrey County Council, and it worked with their Action for Carers, Carers Trust is very active in Surrey too, and the Surrey Centre for Independent Living. And a budget of £300,000 was allocated, and it was spent by 89% of the surgeries. And this was specific to support the carers. It wasn't for a specific health-related issue. It was to support the carers. There were 570 referrals. The average payment was £500, and it was very well received. And some of you might say, well, wouldn't this be another burden for GPs? They'd have to decide what these carers wanted. How would they determine that the request was reasonable? How would they know what to buy? But the partnership with the Surrey Centre for Independent Living, who were paid to do this, meant that they would sit down with the carers who were saying, I want a break, I'm at the end of my tether, and decide what it was that would make the difference. And they would then help the carers to actually spend the money, manage the audit trail, the sorts of things that were purchased. There was a short break where the local authority agreed to provide the short residential break for a young woman with very complex disabilities, but the prescription scheme paid for her parents to go away for a hotel weekend for their 25th wedding anniversary. They didn't normally want ever to go away without their daughter, but this was one occasion they wanted to go away on their own. £500 was used in another case to actually buy a laptop, and the laptop was for the carer of a young soldier who'd come back from Afghanistan. He'd come back with injuries, fortunately physical injuries, not serious, with appalling post-traumatic stress. Hadn't been able to cope, family couldn't cope. By having the laptop, he could go online to the Ministry of Defence, apparently online CBT and other service, and could sort of catch up with support and advice and network with his friends. And there was no doubt the evaluation showed that these sums provided early actually made a big difference. Now the next steps are going to be an indicative budget for individual practice managers, that the Surrey Independent Living Centre is monitoring the spend and giving monthly updates. There's no argument about money being wasted, and with the advent of the clinical commissioning groups, they've got to prove that it's worthwhile. And there's useful information on all sorts of different forms of care and support. And the GPs universally said they were so glad that they could actually offer something practical, something different, something that the carers wanted, and something which might well lead on to more support elsewhere. So we've got to move on to integrating care around patients and their carers. We need to think family, and I think we have a big agenda ahead about promoting general health and well-being. It's in all the legislation, but it's a challenge all the same. And coming back to the NHS mandate, working collaboratively with the local authorities and carers organisations to enable a much wider range of provision, including respite care. I don't like the term respite care, but I do sometimes use it, and I sometimes quote a young disabled man who was part of our Council for Disabled Children's Transition Project. He just got to 18, and I said to him in a workshop, what are your hopes? What are you worried about? He said, the thing I'm most worried about, and I thought he was going to say I won't have anything to do with College Place. He said, I won't be able to go to my short break service anymore. And he said, young people like me need respite from our parents. And he said, that short break service I went to, he said, it's the one place we can have a sleepover with our mates and eat crisps all night and drink Coke and sometimes beer, he said. They don't know about that. And sometimes smoke a cigarette with the window open. And he said he had very complex physical needs. He said, I won't be able to go when I'm 18. What am I going to do? And he was actually had a real sense of loss. That was what he was worried about. So we're moving towards the expert carer. I'm not going to read all these slides because time is running out, but just some final messages from the Standing Commission's recent fact-finding visit for the Minister, that we have to move on to develop a more inclusive engagement with carers. And that one carer said to me, the only question they asked me when we left hospital, husband was severely affected by a stroke, was, have you got your house keys? And she said, they asked me that when we arrived at the hospital. Where are your house keys in case we have to send your husband home early? I wouldn't have believed this except when my brother was so ill 18 months ago and I looked at the discharge. Alas, he died, but looking at the note which was given to you in advance of discharge, top of the list was, and what happens when you leave hospital? Have you got your house keys? Somehow made one feel that one was going to be dumped off by the ambulance, and as long as you had the house keys, they could go away again. But and then there was a reason for it. But this woman said, I nearly said no. She said, I didn't feel we were going home, and I felt terrified and like running away. And that comes down to seeing the family as a whole. And carers spoke very highly of the GP practices and hospital services, which did make the whole family part of the team, and that included young carers too, and of course recognising the role of the voluntary sector. And I know that young carers are the big ambition for Carers Trust this year, and we had Moira and I, a very interesting conference last week on young adult carers. And one of the carers, young people, said, care is not just about older people, it's intergenerational. There are young carers too. And some messages from the young carers, from the coalition of young carers groups, that we need information and respect too. And there are some interesting issues about mediating information about an adult with a health condition, mental health condition, to young people, but they can be managed. It's hard caring for your parents. You're reversing the natural roles, aren't you? Don't shut us out. We're not invisible. A lot of young carers talk about the doors being shut and private conversations. We need somebody to respect our health needs too. And one young carer said to me, health advocacy, our practice nurse is fantastic. We can ring any time. She can deal with the school or college if we can't go in. She helps us ask the right questions and deal with the tricky things like discharge. The parent here had a mental health problem. It takes time and support to be an expert patient and an expert carer. And just ending up with 3 slides about what's medicine for. This is Jean and her daughter Victoria. Victoria was born the same week as Simon. She has tuberous sclerosis. I've known Jean all her life, and she has revolutionised services for carers in North London. She's one of those carers who can enthuse and engage with and work with everybody. Victoria is now reaching the end of life. But Jean said the other day to me, our big challenge for health and for carers in the 21st century is actually recognising that we are going to be living with complex lung conditions over a very long time. Victoria is now, of course, like my son, almost 40. Jean has been a carer for many years. And what's medicine for? Jean felt that, in many respects, medicine for her had been maximising Victoria's quality of life and recognising Victoria as a citizen in her own right. Some people don't feel that health services and provision do that, but they can. And recognising that you are a very old and distinguished medical society, I looked for a quotation, and I haven't gone far enough back, have I? This is 1845. But this was sent to me by a cousin in Germany. And Dr. Adolf Stiller was a very entrepreneurial physician who believed in working in very different ways with his patients. He believed in holistic care. He believed that actually there was always a possibility for a good life without necessarily a cure. And he wrote, the physician and the nurse must never forget that medical art has a far higher range and aim than the prescription of drugs or even food and hygiene means. Even when none of these avail and the patient can't be cured, and that applies to Victoria, whom you saw a few minutes ago in that picture, it is still no small portion of the physician's art to rid his patient's path of thorns and offer hope and support even if he cannot make it bloom with roses. And I think that concept of negotiating, removing the path of thorns is very much the role of all of you and your colleagues, because it is possible to have a good life as a carer. It is possible to have a good life for somebody with a long-term condition, but you do need somebody to remove those thorns, and actually you might even make life bloom as roses. And my last slide, comes from Dr. Trevor Thompson, and he was speaking at the Society for Academic Primary Care conference last year, and he was asked about family carers and trends in the NHS and so on. And he said family carers cannot any longer be a secret army. They have to be partners within the new NHS social care system. And he talked about resilience. He said that's a new metric for primary care, and indeed the new NHS. I would say it probably is a new metric for secondary and tertiary care too. There is more to medicine than medication, he said. Let's design and incentivise the promotion of individual carer, family, patient and whole community resilience for better health. I think Dr. Stiller would have approved of that if he'd still been alive. But I think it's a message for today. Carers are and can be resilient, but their path all too often has the thorns that Dr. Stiller envisaged, and alas, not the roses. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Are you able to answer
Yes, if people have any, yes.
And I just thought it was a fantastic analogy of the cars and the maintenance. I thought that was just really put it into perspective. And you mentioned that we're going to be doing some carer health checks now in our CCG in Nottingham, North and East CCG. And if that's successful in that pilot, hopefully it'll be rolled out. And it's not a great deal of work. It's something which we should be doing routinely. But I think what we need to do is a little measure of practicality and acceptability of running it in primary care, and hopefully it'll be successful.
Make a difference.
Yeah. So any questions at all? Fantastic. Caroline.
Question, it's just a real-life example. I'm a GP in a practice, rural practice, and in the last 2 days I've probably spent 3 hours with a new patient in her 80s, and she's moved to her daughter's house. There seems to be a trend of informing patients, because it's quicker, bad news by telephone. So a week ago, she was informed by telephone that she had what they suspected, which was lung cancer, but with cerebral metastases and swelling. So her daughter decided to bring her home, and on Saturday, the daughter was looking after her. We weren't involved. She got a stair lift installed at her house. And then 2 days later, her mum went off her feet, and within 24 hours needed a hospital bed at home downstairs, and all the palliative care teams involved, and palliative care medicines and all the work to go with it. And I'm thinking, isn't this sad that we're in a situation where this lady, this daughter, I went and I was the person trying to coordinate all this web of care. And I was so sad that she spent thousands of pounds putting a stair lift in, when we as a GPs could have said to her, actually, just hold off, don't do that, because things can go wrong. And actually, yes, do Skype your son in Qatar and say, please come home to give you support, because you're on your own here at home. And so we do have to deal with some very, very powerful emotions. And I think as doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals, one little input can make a big difference.
I think it's a very, very, very interesting and very sad comment. And I think a lot of carers do actually spend a lot of money prematurely. And I was very struck by the fact, I don't know whether there is some private deal with some hospitals or staff to pass on names, addresses and contact details. But my husband hadn't been home for more than 4 or 5 days when we had people ringing up, coming round, offering to sell us hoists, bath aids, stair lifts, not the respectables, what I would call the respectable stair lift companies. I did actually buy, we did put in a stair lift, but not before I'd actually consulted an OT about what was the most sensible thing to do. My husband, when I was out, bought 2 things over the telephone, which were a complete and utter disaster. He was persuaded to get into the bath not by the person who brought this sort of inflatable thing round, but told he'd be able to manage, and couldn't get out. So we had the embarrassing task of myself, my disabled son, the 2 next door neighbours, teenagers, and eventually the paramedics trying to get him out of the bath, and £1,000 down the drain. So I think there are some. I think this does come round to be some much more open and honest discussion, and also persuading people to think carefully about what it is that's actually going to make a difference to them in their home environments. And it can be tricky sometimes, can't it? You can't always predict, of course, what the outcome or what the options will actually be. But I don't know whether Moira will agree, but I do think a lot of families buy things that they don't want. And I've got some things in our garage at home now. I must donate them to the Red Cross, because maybe somebody would like them. That they were part of my husband succumbing to catalogues, for phone calls, catalogues, and knocks. We had knocks on the door about buying a special bed, and somebody must have passed the information on.
Thank you very much, and thank you for such a fantastic talk. Can I just invite Maura just to do a vote of thanks?
I'm very lucky in my job. I come across a great many inspirational people, and there are a number of groups of people who are inspirational. The carers I meet are inspirational. For example, there was a lady I met a couple of weeks ago whose husband has advanced Huntington's, and he is still at home, although very disabled now. And her daughter lives independently and has Huntington's, and is now symptomatic both mentally and physically. And her younger daughter has just been diagnosed as having the gene. And I just think, how do you go on? How do you get up in the morning? But she does, and she doesn't just do that. She manages a support group for families with Huntington's. And, people like that get me out of bed in the morning, because when I'm having a bit of a bad day, I kind of think, you know what, this isn't a bad day. Now, the other people that I find inspirational are the professionals that I work with who, this isn't the sexiest of issues. It doesn't involve any bells and whistles or fancy technology or big budgets. But there are people out there who really have made this their business, who really see the importance of supporting carers and have gone out of their way. Because this isn't something that you get huge career advancement through doing. This is something that people do because they really care about it. And then there are people like Philippa. And I have to say that of all the people I work with, she comes right at the top of the list. She never says no. Nothing is ever too much trouble. And she not only talks with such passion about her own situation and with such pride about her own family, but she fights the corner for every other carer too. Her diary is staggeringly busy, but whenever we ask, she comes. And, from the point of view of Carers Trust, thank you, Philippa. But thank you so much for coming today. I think it's been absolutely inspirational.
And I must just actually reciprocate that, because the one thing that I learned from a very early stage is that organisations like the Carers Trust absolutely matter. And I'm sure if I'd been smarter than my husband and got in touch with our local branch, we wouldn't have bought the ridiculous piece of equipment. But we do actually need organisations like the Carers Trust, because carers do need allies, they do need support, and it's hard work. So a mutual thanks to us, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen.